We have a God who stepped down from a really comfortable place in heaven to a really uncomfortable place on earth. And that just shows the depth of his love for us, that he was willing to come and walk in the dirt with us in the hard things and the good things and the joys and the sorrows, the shame and in the triumph. And just seeing that in the life of Jesus has just shown me that, man, we have a God who deeply loves us, even on the days when we don't feel it. That's when we need to know it the most.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Rooted, where we are rooted in truth, growing in freedom, and prospering in life.
We're your hosts, Josie and Symone Harms, and we are so excited to introduce a very special guest with us today, Lydia Gessner, who just recently graduated Bethel University, and she is one of my amazing cross-country friends and teammates. So thank you so much, Lydia, for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for having me on.
Yeah, we'd just love to hear a little bit about your story. Could you start out with telling us a little bit about your roots?
Yeah, so I grew up in a Christian family, and faith was a really integral part of my life throughout my childhood. I first came to know Jesus when I was a month shy of 3 years old, so I was pretty young.
Wow.
And the story of that is pretty cool. I was sitting watching Ronald Reagan's funeral with my mom on TV, of all things, and I was like asking her why everyone was crying because I didn't fully understand what it was. And she said, well, he was a good man, but he knew Jesus, so he's going to be in heaven again someday. So I was like, well, I want to know Jesus and I want to go to heaven someday. And so that was the moment that I accepted Christ, right there sitting in the big green chair in my house with my mom. And so she was a little nervous that I was too young, but just went over everything with me the next morning. And she's like, you pretty much got it. So
that's
from
so
there,
cute. Ronald Reagan. Wow.
I know. So, and honestly, it's kind of crazy when you think of the rest of my story, how that I initially met Jesus at a funeral. Mm-hmm. And so just very powerful part of my testimony. And then from there, I grew up going to a Catholic school, which was more of a Christian education. I grew up in a small town in Iowa, and I was an only child, and so a lot of the kids in our neighborhood went there, and so my parents sent me there, and I just had a great experience. And then I went to a Pentecostal church, so very opposite end of the spectrum.
Yes, wow.
Yeah, we drove an hour every Sunday to church, and that was such a cool experience growing up, of not only seeing my parents really put an emphasis on, we're going to drive to go to church, and church is important to us, and we want to be a part of a faith community, but also just those times in the car were really fun as a family. It was never electronics or things. It was always just talking and laughing and listening to music and sharing stories. And so those were really big parts of my growing up, and just, watching my parents live out their faith was always really impactful for me.
How was that navigating, going back and forth between a Catholic perspective but also Pentecostal perspective? Because those are pretty extreme.
Yeah.
How did that balance? How did that shape you?
Yeah, so I feel like looking back, it really was a very important part in how I am rooted in Christ, because I learned from an early age how to distinguish what I believe and also respect the beliefs of others, because my parents, they really just put in me from a young age kind of like, this is what we believe, emphasizing those, like, we both believe in Jesus and we both like talk to God and we know what it's like to have a relationship with him. And so at the time it just seemed pretty normal, but looking back, I'm like, wow, that was
not
actually...
everyone has that experience.
Right, yeah, that was probably pretty good for me. So yeah, that was, I think, really cool. And then to also be a part of a different community outside of my small town was cool, because I grew up in a small rural town in Iowa, but then our church was an hour away in a really diverse inner city. And so that was cool to just get a different experience and meet a lot of different people from a young age. And so I feel like it really opened my eyes to the variety of stories in God's kingdom.
Yeah, and living in a small town, you also have lots of opportunities to be involved in lots of activities, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so do you just want to describe some of those activities? What were you involved in?
Oh, goodness. I actually had to put a list on my phone in high school for scholarships because I couldn't remember all of them.
That's incredible.
Yeah, which shows I was a little overcommitted. But some of the main ones were, I started out, like Josie said, I've been in cross country for 10 years. And so I started out in middle school. And I've also run track for 10 years, and those have been huge parts of my life, which I'm sure we'll get into at some point. And then I also played basketball. My dad was a big basketball player, and so that was a huge part of my growing up. I played soccer, did dance for a little bit. Those were when I was super little. But in high school, I was involved in speech. And then I was the head of SAD my senior year, which is a very unfortunate acronym, but it stands for Students Against Destructive Decisions. And so I got a lot of experience working in the community and working with facilitating a team, but then also working with community members and getting people to join our cause because we were planning a mock accident for our senior year. But ultimately, COVID canceled that. I also was involved, had a really cool opportunity to intern at my local newspaper. And so it was cool to just be able to drive around to different towns in our county, and I'd cover little local events like county fairs and different festivals. And then also kind of almost, we didn't have a high school paper, and so it felt like I got to do a little bit of that and interviewing some of my classmates and teachers and things for different things. And ultimately, I've taken journalism classes at Bethel and been a creative writing major. And I've known since I was a kid that I wanted to be an author and that was what God was calling me to. And I didn't always love writing. So I feel like, or I didn't like papers, and I thought that was what writing was. I like
that's
research
kind of how
papers.
I feel.
Yeah. And so people always tell me, they're like, oh, you're a writing major. You must absolutely love writing research papers. I'm like, I don't really like it either. And so, so the newspaper was really cool because I started to get a glimpse into creative writing and storytelling, and I loved it. And it just does a lot of different mediums, and I love talking to people. So it was fun to hear people's stories in that way.
That's so good. Wow. And I do love how you are so good at telling stories. And yeah, you are like, and so that's super cool, your whole experience in speech, but then just like running with you always have some amazing stories to tell, and stories that not only are fun, but also that are impactful. And one story that really speaks to me specifically is the one with your dad and just having to navigate that grief and being rooted in periods of grief. So could you kind of tell our audience a little bit about that journey of you growing up? Because it's a story that I think a lot of people can learn from and relate to.
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, thinking back, the way that I first met Jesus is really ironic in a lot of ways and a lot of foreshadowing to the experiences of grief in my life. And so when I was 12 years old, my dad started getting sick, and at first we didn't know what it was. And then ultimately we found out it was cancer. And so my family prayed for 2 years. So between when I was in 6th grade and when I was in 8th grade, we were just believing for a miracle. And he was having chemo and treatments and everything. And it was just a time when my family found ourselves on our knees, because there's always a point in your life when reality hits and things don't turn out the way that you expect them to. And I think that's where your faith can either fall apart or become stronger. And it was really amazing to see my mom and my dad and how they were just fighting and believing for a miracle. And it gave me so much courage to do the same as a kid. And so I really didn't have a doubt in my mind that he was going to be healed. But ultimately, when I was in 8th grade, just at the start of my 8th grade year, he passed away. And I just remember being so confused. And I was like, okay, God, it's kind of that I believe in a God who heals, but I didn't see that. And I believe in a God who's loving, but yet he allowed us to go through this. And I believe in a God who's good, and yet my family just suffered for 2 years. And now I'm never going to have my dad again.
Yeah.
And so it was a lot of just wrestling with that. And looking back, the work that I've done with grief since then, I realized what a role model my mom was in that. And I talked a little bit about the green chair in my house, and it's this really cute, overstuffed, very worn green chair that's covered in dog hair at this point. But it's so cute, and it's just perfectly fits my mom and I. And so my whole life, it's been a place where when I'm having a hard day and when I'm sad, that's where we go and cry all the tears and say all the prayers. And so after my dad died, obviously it was a place where we were spending a lot of time. And it was really cool for me to see my mom in that space and elsewhere just being really honest, and sometimes more honest than I saw her being. Not that she wasn't honest in public, but, you know, you're kind of trying to deal with everything. And then she was really vulnerable with me about how she was questioning God's love and his goodness and kind of all the things I talked about that I was also confused with. And yet I didn't see her give up her faith. And my mom's an incredible woman of faith and very strong in her beliefs and has been a Christian almost her whole life. And yet here she was, you know, way older than me and having this happen, and just kind of realizing that, yeah, God maybe is just, there's things that I believed about him that now I'm having to wrestle with. And so that was super cool for me and gave me the permission to also wrestle with those things where I think I wouldn't have had that otherwise. And so ultimately, we really felt like our motto was choose joy. And God was very clear from the very beginning after my dad's passing that we still had a testimony. And I vividly remember sitting in the front row of his funeral and a worship song. We were playing worship songs, and when one of them was playing, just looking over and seeing my mom lifting her hands. And it doesn't mean there weren't tears rolling down her face or mine, and just mimicking her, and I lifted my hands as well. And I think that was such a moment of like, okay, God, we don't understand, and we are just heartbroken, but we're still going to trust you and know that somehow, some way, there's still going to be a testimony that comes out of this. And so going into high school, that was a huge thing for me, was just choosing joy and deciding that in the midst of everything, God was still good, even if I didn't always understand. And ultimately, I started to grow closer and closer to him as I kind of wrestled with some of those questions.
That's so beautiful. I love how you talk about choosing joy and the idea that, like, even when times are tough, you can still be joyful. I think a lot of times you think, oh, you can't be joyful when it's sad, but joy is different than happiness. Sometimes it's like, oh, I'm sad, but I can choose that, yeah, God is going to be faithful. The same God of Jacob, the same God of Joseph, the same God of Ruth is here today, and his kingdom reigns forever. I love the verse, Romans 15:13. It says, the God of hope will fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. And I think your story is such a testament to that, because you are someone who radiates joy. And you have, I mean, we've run together so much, and I hear all the things that are going on in your life and the hardships, and we share those together. But yet you are someone that radiates joy. And that is such a beautiful example for all of us. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Josie. I was going to say that both of you are people who just radiate joy as well. And that's something I admire most about you. And I know that you've struggled with a lot of different things in your life, and yet you are one of the most joyful people I know, Josie. And on runs and everything in our team, you really model that. And I think that all three of our stories are really a testament to something that I've come to learn about joy, and that true joy can only come on the other side of pain. And I think that you learn to appreciate the good things in life when you have experienced immense suffering. And I think something I didn't realize in high school, too, that I wish I could tell my younger self, is that choosing joy doesn't always mean ignoring your pain, and that in order to choose joy and actually have true joy, you have to face your suffering, and you have to face the hardship and the wrestling and the questions with God, and truly just cry out to him and sometimes scream at him. But that's what he wants from us, and he wants that depth of relationship where we can be honest with him. And on the other side of that is joy, because we've come to know him on a deeper and deeper level.
What would you say is your best advice on finding joy? Like in your daily living and your daily life, how do you find that joy?
I feel like it varies in my life and in the seasons of life that I'm in. I actually just am finishing up a study of happiness class at Bethel that's based on the one by the Yale psychologist. And so that's been really interesting to kind of learn. We've looked at from a Christian and secular perspective of different things that make us happy. And something that I've really implemented that I think Coach does a great job implementing for us in cross country is gratitude lists. And so I've started doing that. I try to do it like 5 out of 7 days a week. I'll make a list. And I really love the simple things in life and just the little things. I think sometimes the big things, as much as we think they're going to bring us happiness, are going to fade just as quickly as the little things do. Amen. And so, yeah, I feel like that's something that God's continually reminding me of. But I love, my mom always talks about that if you can't find joy in taking the garbage to the curb, then it's hard to find joy in the most amazing things that happen to you in your life. And I think, as we know, living in a small town, you're not constantly faced with all these big entertainment venues or different things that are going to bring you these really high senses of happiness or joy in the moment. But we have to just continually cultivate it, because it's more focused on the people around you and the little things that you have. And so I think, living in a small town and then living with a small family too has really grown that in me. And so, sometimes when I'm stressed, I just try to enjoy a little cup of coffee, or the feeling of putting my hair up in a clip and getting it off the back of my neck. Or just
Okay, why are those
like
little
that.
things so good though?
Yeah, I don't know.
They are.
And it's just reminders of God too, because he created all those things for our enjoyment.
Wow, that's beautiful. And I love how you talked about just having the courage to bring your grief before God and be honest before him. And I think part of it is also letting other people in and being honest with them. So how do you navigate that? Because that's something that's really hard to be honest. It's one thing to be honest with God when it's like, okay, yeah, he does technically know everything.
Yeah.
But talking to a friend that might not know about what you're dealing with, how do you have the courage to do that?
Yeah, that's been a struggle for me for a really long time. I would say that I've seen a breakthrough in that just in the past year, but that's something God's been working on with me for a long time, because in middle school when my dad passed away, obviously it's in middle school, you're not to the level of emotional maturity that adults are. And so my classmates did not respond in the ways that I really wanted them to or needed them to in the moment. I just remember sitting in class and thinking, okay, well, if everyone's going to pretend like this isn't a big deal, then I guess it's not, and I can just keep moving on with my life. And I think that was just like a kind of switch in my brain that probably wasn't super healthy. But also, I don't blame them. Like, I've forgiven them, and I think that I look back on the ways that I wasn't there for them in some of the really big, hard things. But I didn't have that community that I have now at Bethel when I've dealt with grief in college. And so I think it is important to acknowledge that when you lose people as a kid, your community is going to look different than when you lose people as an adult. And so I remember just crying in bathroom stalls. And people also didn't know my dad was sick. That was one thing that my mom has debated over the years, whether that was a good decision. Ultimately, I think it was, because, small towns can be very gossipy. But
Yes.
we didn't tell my school until the very end. And so my classmates didn't really know. You could kind of tell from looking at him. But on the day-to-day, I could come back and having been at the hospital an hour away the night before and gotten back late and gone to school the next day, and nobody had any idea.
Wow.
And that was just like, I couldn't go to anybody because they didn't know. And so I felt like that built a pattern in me that I became really close with my mom because she was my confidant, and ultimately God also was too. But it was harder for me to kind of break that ice and bring it up to other people. And in high school, I had a really good friend who was a running buddy, and that was honestly where I feel like I learned to be vulnerable, was on runs, because you're not looking them in the eye, or I don't know.
So true.
Yeah, I
can see
mean, like,
that.
we are so vulnerable on runs, but Josie.
Yeah, there's actually research done on like people who are walking side by side, especially men, can actually open up more if you're not face to face, which is actually super interesting. You'll have to look into more research that's just saying from me, but I've heard it from like multiple speakers and stuff, so it's pretty cool.
That's I never would have thought of that, but it's so
I didn't
true.
know that either.
Because it feels more scary when you're like, oh, you're actually listening.
Yeah. Which there is something to be said about, I've heard too, like, it's very healing to have somebody look you in the eye with a lot of empathy when you're telling your story. But I think right off the bat, it is like when you're having a hard time being vulnerable, like you said, like the research shows, it's an easier way. And so I think I started being a little more vulnerable with some of my teammates, and people knew my story. And especially during COVID, it was kind of my breaking point where I was not surrounded by community at school anymore. And it was just my mom and I. And she didn't always understand because I had that community at school that I was away from now, and it was just a different dynamic. And so there were parts of our home life that she could relate to, but things about school that she couldn't. And so I remember just FaceTiming my cross country coach at one point and crying to her. And that was just probably one of the first big moments where it was like, okay, vulnerability is a must, and I can't keep it away anymore. And so, yeah, I think in the past year, some of the breakthroughs have been just being in such a supportive community in college, and people slowly starting to come to know my story. And then also realizing the power of a story, and that if you share when you're vulnerable, the people I admire most are the ones like you, Josie, who are really vulnerable on like, this is my story and this is who I am. And also like saying if you're having a hard day, and then being authentic and honest on the hard days and the good days as well. And when I started to realize those are the people I admire most, I was like, why am I not one of those people sometimes? And so that's been a big realization for me.
Do you have any advice for people as they're navigating responding to others being vulnerable and opening up to their story? Because I know sometimes it's hard to really engage with people like, oh, if someone does share, my dad has cancer and I'm really struggling with it, sometimes it's hard for me to know how to respond to that. And I want to honor that well, but I also don't want to be like, oh, like God's got it, because like that's not always helpful, even though it's true. So how do you, as someone who's gone through that, what were some of the things that were really the most helpful to you that our listeners could maybe learn from, so that when they're having to navigate hard conversations like that, they know how to respond?
Yeah, I think that's such an important topic. And like you said, it's not super helpful when people say, oh, well, God's got it. Like, I think that for me, I found that I need to lament on my own with God first before I go to people, because sometimes then some of those comments are super hurtful if I haven't processed the raw emotions first. But eventually I do need that encouragement of like, God will bring good from this and things like that. But I need some space first to kind of be really honest with God and with my inner circle. And so I think just acknowledging the different levels that people are at. But it's a struggle for me too, I'm not going to lie. I've lost a lot of people and I've grieved a lot of different ways. But I still don't always know what to say when people say things. And I know I've said the wrong things a million times. But I think my encouragement is just say something. That was the 100% the most hurtful thing, was that my classmates said nothing. And if they had just acknowledged it, even if they'd said the wrong thing, people have come up to me afterwards when I've talked about things like conversations like this, and they're like, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I've probably, after you've grieved, said like the most horrible thing. And I was like, I don't even remember. But I remember that you said something. Or I remember one girl who I didn't even know came up to me after my dad died, and we were track teammates, but we went to different schools. And her mom had cancer, and she came up to me and told me how sorry she was. And that was like 9 years ago. And I still remember that. And I'm sure there was a million things that people said that were hurtful, but those don't stand out to me as much as just the ones where people took the courage to show that they really cared. And so I think just something that I found is pretty safe is saying, like, I'm praying for you, because that acknowledges that,
hey, I see you, and I'm thinking about you.
Yeah.
Yes, and God is also thinking about you. Honestly, the best person that I can go to in my grief is my roommate, Heather. And I found it so helpful because she doesn't try to fix it. She just sits there, and sometimes she'll even cry with me or hug me and hand me Kleenex and chocolate and whatever is needed, but she just sits there. And I think sometimes we try to fix things and say things and feel like we have to fill the silence, but honestly, it's most powerful when you're just sitting there being with them.
Yeah, the presence of a loving friend.
Yeah. So, and I'm sure you guys, I don't know if you have stories of that too, of things that have helped you, because even when people are sick, it's sometimes hard to know what to say. And so...
Yeah, I would say for me personally, there's something about that presence, and it might not even have to be a physical presence. Maybe it's literally calling my mom on speakerphone, and we might not even be talking, but I just feel like she's there. And as someone, I'm a verbal processor, and so sometimes like runs are huge for me, where getting to go on a run with you and just like kind of go off on all of the things that were going wrong in that moment. And by the time I say it and verbalize it and I'm honest about it and just have someone to sit there and listen to it, it's all of a sudden like, oh wait, it's not that bad. I'm okay. Yeah. And I have someone here that's supporting me. So I think there's so much truth in just having someone to be there as a presence and listen.
Yeah.
Because it's like on a run, if I'm saying that, no one's necessarily saying anything back, but it feels like they're there with me.
Right. And I think everyone copes with that in a different way. Like some people, like you said, just need to talk about it, need to verbally say that. Some people need to run side by side. Some people just need to sit there and have that physical presence. And yeah, I would definitely say I'm one who just wants to be hugged.
Yeah, like, you're definitely a physical touch person.
I love physical touch, let me just say. But I think even just not saying what's wrong, if I'm having a sad day and then someone just will give me a hug, like a good friend or like my sister, it's like, I don't even need to tell you anything. Just holding you right now is enough. And that just makes me just feel comforted. So yeah, I think everyone deals with that in certain ways. And I think it's super important to just kind of reflect on yourself and notice what that is so that you can make those decisions like, hey, you know what? Can I talk to you about this? Or hey, can we go for a run? And I think noticing that in you is super helpful.
I love how you mentioned, Symone, the importance that everyone does process it differently. And I think that's a really good point where you can even ask people, hey, I'm so sorry. How can I support you in this time? That's meant a lot to me when I've dealt with things, people asking me, how can I support you? Because sometimes you don't know what's best for them. Like you said, you don't always know. Some people want encouragement. Some people just want you to be sitting there. So just asking, I think that shows that you
Honesty,
care.
super important.
Yeah.
100%.
And I think that it is so, like you said, Symone, it's so good to know that there's different ways to process. And I wish that I'd known sooner what mine were. And I think knowing that about yourself is such a huge part of self-awareness of, I need to get away and journal, or I need to go for a run, or things like that. And I need to cry out to God in the prayer chapel alone, or I need to sit with friends. And so, yeah, I think that knowing how you can support yourself, but also knowing that about your friends, like that Symone needs physical touch on a hard day, is like such a cool way that you can support them when they don't necessarily know what the next steps are going forward.
Yeah, and kind of going back to your story with how you coped through the grief, you talked a little bit about how at the beginning you're kind of like, okay, why is this happening to me, God? Like, I thought you were a good God. I thought you were a healer. And just how you changed throughout that. How did you get from the point of kind of questioning to the point of joy? What does that story look like?
I feel like the joy never really left, which is kind of just a powerful part of my testimony, I would say, because I know that wasn't me. I know that was God. And I can remember in the midst of my dad being really sick, sitting in math class in middle school, and just the joy of the Lord hit me. And I was like, I have nothing to be joyful about right now. But I was like, could barely contain myself in math class. Like, I was like, I'm so happy right now, like so joyful. And that's like, doesn't happen to be super often, but that's just like such a testament to who God is, that joy doesn't have to end when hard things happen. But so I also think, there definitely is a period of like, okay, I'm very confused right now. And I think it's been a long process, but ultimately my kind of version of the problem of evil that I've come to know is that God is a good God, and he doesn't want us to suffer. Humans chose this, and yet he also allows it for our good, like we see with Job. And ultimately, it's for his good and for his glory, and it's also for our good and ultimately our restoration. And I think when I see how the stories of other people have impacted me who have gone through hardship, and how my story has impacted other people, it shows me that there's a way to encourage each other through our stories in a broken world. And I think a huge insight for me in terms of seeing God in the midst of grief is that when we grieve, we partner with his heart, because he never wanted the world to look this way. And I think thinking about the fact that I love the story of Lazarus and Jesus weeping, because he saw Martha and Mary and how they were hurting and saying, like, Lord, if you had been there, our brother would not have died. And what is God's response to those questions is literally weeping. And so he doesn't try to say, but I'm good, but I'm this. Like, he just cries. And then ultimately, we know that he raises him from the dead, and we know that Lazarus lives again. But then eventually he dies because he was human. And so it's like when we lament the things in life, I think it can ultimately bring about a greater sense of redemption, because we have to wrestle with God in those questions and then say, okay, you've given me this story for a reason. How can I step into your work of redemption in the world with my story?
Amen. That's so good. So taking all those principles going forward, now you're jumping into graduating and a whole, like, a lot of unknown. How are you applying those same principles to your future?
Yeah. So I'm just excited to see what the Lord is up to. I'm going to step into a role as a development coordinator at a nonprofit that supports kids and families in foster care. And so obviously foster care and adoption are worlds where there is a lot of grief. And so I've had conversations with people about what grief looks like. It's different, it's similar, it's all the things in foster care. And so just what that'll look like in my role to be telling really hard stories. But I think my own journey with grief has taught me how to process even the difficult stories of others and lament those before the Lord, and learn to kind of digest it in a way to where it's healthy instead of unhealthy. And so that I can ultimately, hopefully, do a lot of good and not just get burned out. And I'm trying to be really intentional about asking people for wisdom on how to do that, because I know it will be a lot of hard stories. But I'm excited to see what the Lord will do with it. And I think when we've had hard stories, the Lord often places us in spots where there are a lot of people with similar stories and with similar pain, because, like I said, he wants us to be able to help bring redemption. And it's not a Christian organization. And so I think it'll be really cool to also just even live my life in such a way that hopefully I'm saying the name of Jesus, even if his name is never spoken. And so I think
that's really cool.
Yeah. I'm just excited to see what the Lord has for it. And yeah, it'll be sobering stories for sure, but also really powerful.
Can you just briefly touch on the story of how you got this position? Because I think it's crazy how you applied for something you weren't realizing you're applying for.
Yeah, so I never even applied for this position, which is crazy, because I heard about it through a family friend, reached out, had an informational interview, and then they wanted to do a second interview. And so during that second interview, I thought I was applying for a communications position. Well, she said, we're actually deciding to hire full-time the development coordinator and kind of wait on this communications position because we need this more. And she said, would you be interested in interviewing and continuing this interview? And basically, otherwise, the interview was over. And so I was kind of like,
Have to decide on the spot.
Yeah,
That's crazy.
I had like 0.2 seconds, but I guess in the moment I was just like, this seems like a now decision. And so I just remember having a conversation with the Lord in my head, and I was like, what? And he's like, I've gotten you this far, you just have to trust me. And then I immediately followed that up with, but I'm not super qualified for this position.
Oh my gosh.
I just have to let you know.
I love it.
And so, but I think something that was super cool and something that I like about the organization is that they're very passionate people. And so she followed that up with, well, we will train you, but we would rather train a passionate person to do tasks than have to train someone to be passionate for our mission. And so I was like, I'm passionate, not super qualified, but I'm passionate. And so I actually think the more she was describing the role and the speaking opportunities and the storytelling opportunities of working with fundraising and the grant writing and all that, some of them are really skills that I want to develop more. And so some of them are also skills that I do feel comfortable in. And so, like I said, with my experiences in SAD, I started to see how the Lord had prepared me in different ways, and then also how he could be using this to prepare me for different ministry roles in the future. And so I think it'll be a good mix of challenge and comfort. And so I'm excited about it. And it's going to be a lot of people-oriented work, which is definitely what is best for me and my mental and spiritual and everything health versus sitting behind a laptop all day. So I think ultimately it was in my best interest and the Lord's best interest.
That's so good. And I love how it just shows that God is working in and through every situation, and that he's going to open the doors that you need and realize this is where you're best fit. And I love just idea of being passionate. I think nowadays it's kind of scary thinking, I'm not qualified for any of these jobs after I graduate. But ultimately, people will teach you, and they want someone that has a heart that's humble and willing to learn. So thanks, Lydia.
Oh, and that's something I love about you too, Josie, is you've stepped into a lot of roles where I'm like, whoa, that is so cool. But you've just learned so much from saying yes. And I think that's something that I really admire about you and want to get better at. And I think you only get to learn those skills when you are able to just courageously say yes and then be willing to learn along the way.
I think that's amazing. I think saying yes is such a good thing, just because a lot of times fear can hold people back. Like, oh, well, what if I'm not qualified? What if I don't do good? And the Lord equips the called, right? And I think it's also super important to know when to say no as well. Because I think all of us know that we say yes to a lot of things. And a lot of times that can make us then not be successful at those things and end up burning us out and realizing, oh, shoot, now I'm forced to say no, because our bodies are meant to rest. And so it does get to a certain level where, you know what, I'm going to prioritize what I love and what I'm made to do, and I'm going to say yes to those things and be really good at those things. And, it's okay if I let some people down. It's okay if I say no to these things, because I think letting people down in the fear of what other people think or the fear of missing out on opportunities, I think that's something me, at least personally, stops me from saying no.
Same here.
Yeah, so I think that's just important to go back to the one who created you and say, give me discernment. What should I say yes to? What should I say no to? So, yeah, I think you make a great point. And I think your story just shows how much you have trusted God and how much you put your joy and your hope and your life into God despite all of your circumstances that you've gone through. So thank you so much for just sharing your story with us. And if you could just tell the audience one thing that you would encourage them to be rooted in, what would that one thing be?
I think I would say God's love. And that comes from somebody who has at times in her life questioned it. And ultimately, I've come back to the fact that we have a God who does weep with us in the midst of our suffering and is that person who sits with us in the silence of our doubts. And then he's also present when we're laughing around the table at team dinners. And I think we have a God who stepped down from a really comfortable place in heaven to a really uncomfortable place on earth. And that just shows the depth of his love for us, that he was willing to come and walk in the dirt with us and in the hard things and the good things and the joys and the sorrows, the shame, and then the triumph. And just seeing that in the life of Jesus and in the Gospels has just shown me that, man, we have a God who deeply loves us, even on the days when we don't feel it. That's when we need to know it the most.
That's
amazing.
huge.
Amen.
Wow. Thank you so much, Lydia. And
thank
you for
guys.
just being such a light and example to everyone you interact with. You're such a blessing. And I know that so many people listening to this podcast are going to be blessed by your experience. So we appreciate
Thank you so
it.
much, Lydia.
Thank you guys so much for having me. You're such a joy. It's so good to know you guys.